Modern Podcast, where we establish convening power in the built environment. In this season, we are covering conversations around the topic of careers. Today, we have with us Evan Smith, who is a licensed general contractor, real estate developer, and serial entrepreneur. Evan is a co-founder at Highland Technologies, a startup company that's working on a deep energy retrofit panel system, and the developer of several multifamily housing projects in Boston, including projects like cross-laminated timber buildings in the city. With that, let's welcome Evan Smith.
Hi, guys.
Hey, Evan.
Nice to meet you.
Good to have you here.
Nice to meet you. So speaking of career, you, Evan, you're one of very few people that I know with a very diverse experience, wearing many hats, working in the built environment for a few decades now. Let's go back to when you first started this journey, and can you first tell us a little about what drew you to the building industry and the career trajectory that brought you to where you are now?
Yeah, definitely. So I got my start at 4 years old, if you can believe that. I was a kid who really loved playing with Lego sets. Legos were just starting to become a thing in the early 80s, and my father actually built our first house. He was, an engineer who was starting off in his career, had no money. And so, he figured the best way to get a house built for us would be to build it himself. Now, that was a many-year process for him. So it never really got finished, but it was a long process. But seeing that as a young kid, I got really into the idea of buildings and what they represented, and I started building lots of houses in my Lego sets. I'd even include chimneys and plumbing chases and all sorts of little details in them because I was fascinated by it. I was really hooked. I also come from a long line of makers. I have a family member who was a senior person at Fender Guitars. I've got a number of artists and builders in my family on both sides, and I've always been around people that make things, and I love making things. And so I think that's how I ended up where I did. I started off out of high school, working on masonry projects instead of going to college. I quickly realized that banging stones together and laying brick was a really hard life and was not going to be where I wanted to go or get me where I wanted to be. So I ended up going to college. I got a degree at Tufts, combined degree in architecture and studio arts. From there, I started a business doing large-scale, high-end landscape architecture. I couldn't really tell you why. It was something that was available. This was the early 2000s. I was able to build a good business out of it. At some point, right before the real estate crash, I kind of burned out on that. Building really high-end landscapes for people with a lot of money can be a bit soul-sucking. Even though the work was beautiful, it's really nice to work with beautiful trees and beautiful materials. It really didn't feel like there was any purpose to it, or any bigger purpose to it, other than just proving that this rich guy over here has got a better landscape than this rich guy over there. And I just felt like I needed to do more. And so right around the housing crash, I started running into some people: Simon Hare, Declan Keefe, Travis Anderson, Steve Daly. We were all kind of working in this idea of improving energy efficiency in housing, knowing that climate change was coming. We figured there had to be a better way. And that, formed into Placetailor, which was my most recent venture. And Placetailor was one of the first to roll out passive house construction in the United States. We did our first passive house in 2008. We did the first multifamily passive house in the US in 2010. We lost a lot of money, learned a lot of really hard lessons. but really helped progress passive house and sustainable building in the United States.
So real quick,
And
can you tell us a little bit more
yeah,
about Passive House? Like for someone
yeah,
who's not
yeah.
familiar, what is Passive House?
So, simplest way to put it, um, your typical home needs a boiler or a furnace to heat it, usually around 100,000 BTUs, give or take. Um, we were building houses that we could heat with a hair dryer, which is about 3 to 5,000 BTUs. So, Passive House is basically utilizing computer aided energy modeling to model out the input of the sun, airflow within a house, how much heat does a human produce, how much heat does your refrigerator produce, how much heat does your light bulb produce, et cetera, et cetera. Put it all into an energy model and then design a house that has optimized insulation, optimized windows, optimized ventilation to basically treat heat as a valuable resource and keep as much of it as you can. And so, when we
And this
first got
is, and
into,
you're working in Boston, right? So this is essential.
yeah,
It's pretty
cold
cold,
climate. Yeah, cold
right?
climate, exactly. Yeah, so feel free to stop me at any time. I can totally be a fire hose. So yeah, so we got into that. A lot of challenges. When I first learned to build, I worked for Habitat for Humanity a little bit while I was in college, learning construction and learning about leading crews and stuff like that. And the difference between those homes that I built with Habitat and what we were building was almost night and day. You have to untrain an industry that making a leaky house is not actually a good thing.
Hmm.
There was plenty of builders that I learned from who said, "Oh, the house has to leak because if you make it too tight, it'll rot or it will mold," and just a complete mindset shift. And then learning how to use materials differently. And I think, for me, what really drew me to that, having a bit of an art background in college, growing up around people that are creative and makers, the idea that, in order to solve a problem, I can take a material and use it differently or use it in a new way never really seemed like a hindrance to me. It always kind of felt like, okay, this is all made up anyways. Like the world we live in is all make believe anyways. So therefore, if you have new ideas or new ways to approach things, go for it, try it, take the risk. And yeah, so I applied that to Placetailor, as did, the original founders with me. And we started doing Passive House on a regular basis. And we basically drew a line in the sand and said that any house or any building we built had to be Passive House. Even though barely anybody else was doing it, we just figured, okay, if we can make a house that you can heat with a hairdryer, why not? Like, why would you do anything else? So, yeah, I'll stop there for a minute.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that was a great summary. Well, when we met at Placetailor, the company was at a growth mode where we were expanding more into the real estate development side, and there were some restructuring of the company. It unfortunately, the business did not continue, and it dissolved in 2022. Looking back, can you tell us if there are any like memorable moments of that business, and we can change something if you go back? Like, what would you have done?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. Failure is something that is necessary to have successful businesses. Um, if you don't have failure, you're not learning, you're not getting better, and only through failure do you arrive where you're ultimately supposed to be. So while this failure has been hard emotionally, and I could have seen myself moving on with Placetailor for another 10 or 15 years, in many ways, I'm glad that I'm on to new things with new perspectives. So I think to start, when we started Placetailor, all of us were in our late 20s to early 30s. Very few of us were married. Many of us didn't even own our own homes. And so it was really easy to be super idealistic and super hopeful about what we could do. And I think we were probably a little bit naive to not knowing what we didn't know, so to speak. And so, we took on a lot of projects that other, more mature companies probably wouldn't have taken on. Financially challenging, logistically challenging, technically challenging. And, for many years we were successful at that because we could pay ourselves less. We weren't trying to feed children or pay mortgages. And so it was great. It's a time that I will always look back on for the rest of my life as one of the most exciting times because we were trying to not only do Passive House, but we were trying to run the business as a co-op. And we tried to have a flat hierarchy, if that makes any sense, where, every person in the company had the same vote as the next person. So we could, the laborer had the same vote as the CEO of the company. And so we were trying to be really egalitarian, very democratic, very cooperative. And I think, at the time that made a lot of sense. But as we got older, as some of us started to buy homes and have kids and, get mortgages, we realized that, we needed to improve our income and improve the financial viability of the business. And I think over time, that started to split what was originally a very collaborative group of people. And I think different people had different lines that they would or would not cross in terms of risk taking and sensibility and purpose. I think some of us, were willing to eat, ramen, eat dried ramen and, keep our rent cheap, while others of us thought, well, if I'm going to feed my family and keep a roof over their head, I have greater income. And so it became more and more complicated over time to keep that sense of purpose and mission first versus profitability and financial status in check. And I think over time, financial concerns started to win out more and more, and we lost some people who, looking back, were really core to that vision and that mission. I think my biggest regret is not figuring out how to keep those people and keep that sensibility at the same time that we're trying to build a more financially viable business. And we ended up swinging too far to the other side, where we brought in, a group of newer folks that were very financially savvy, and they had worked in bigger firms in corporate America. And we swung, from being like this, call it like hippie, crunchy, kumbaya world to this like corporate world. And we didn't put enough time into making that shift. And it just ultimately, I think, looking back, Placetailor died on culture, really more than anything. And also, I think, we had a bit of arrogance because we had solved a lot of big problems. And I think we thought that we could kind of do anything and do everything. And so we were a development company. We were an architecture company. We were a construction company. We were a tech company. We were a nonprofit. We were a for-profit. I can just keep going down this list, and it got totally out of control. And I think we thought that by having this like intensely integrated model that we would, save the world, if you would. But really, in the end, I think we hit this point where if you do everything, you do nothing well. And I think that, some of the folks that left before the failure have gone off and hyper-focused on certain things, like they're just focusing on architecture and they're just focusing on construction, or they're just focusing on development. and they're thriving because they're taking a lot of the lessons they learned at Placetailor and rolling them forward into more integrated practice, but focused practice. And I think that's something that's super important. So
Yeah, that's a great point. So, as we talked over the phone, we know that almost 80% of companies that are startups, 5 years, when they hit 5 years, like 80% kind of dies along that way. So, but the general media, they only focus on the success stories. So we thought there was something that we can learn in those failures and talking about those failures. And I think you gave a great summary on what you've learned. How did you process that new learnings to your new venture? And could you tell us a little bit more about Highland Park Technologies?
yeah, absolutely. And to be clear, I'm still processing. It's an
Yeah.
ongoing thing because it was really the end of 2022, and it was fairly abrupt. Um, so Highland Park Technologies is a very small startup with a couple other folks who I met through Placetailor. We started because we recognize both in Placetailor and outside of Placetailor that retrofitting existing buildings is necessary to meet the 2050 climate goals. It's going to take more than just putting solar panels on roofs and changing over to electric boilers. It's going to take a lot more than that to get us to zero carbon. And at Placetailor, we had done a number of deep energy retrofits over close to 13 years. We did about a half dozen, and we lost money on every single one. We could never figure out a pricing structure that made sense for the client as an end user and made sense from a science perspective in terms of actual energy modeling, and made sense from trying to meet this greater goal. And Minku has probably heard me say this too many times, much to many people's chagrins, but I'd rather tear down a building right now than try to retrofit it, because I just know that as a builder, I can build a new passive house cheaper than I can retrofit most existing buildings. So
That's interesting
it.
because I'm just going to
Yeah.
say that's interesting because there's a lot of architects who feel, a lot of people who think that, oh, it makes sense to retrofit existing buildings. The building stock is
Oh,
there. How can we update it? But
don't
you're
get me
saying
wrong.
on the practical side, it's maybe not as feasible.
Don't get me wrong. So ideally, we'll be retrofitting everything.
Hmm.
That's like from a carbon environmental perspective. Absolutely, we have to retrofit. Like, we cannot just tear down all the housing stock in Boston and rebuild it. The footprint from that in terms of like embodied carbon would be so astronomical that it's not worth it. But from a financial perspective, as purely a builder and developer, I can't justify retrofits on most projects right now. Um, there's an interesting, if anybody's interested, there's a company called Big Meister who, I know them well. I love them. They're a great company. Their CEO recently did a talk at Nessie about why they were stopping doing retrofits. And it's something that gets much deeper into all the challenges and problems around it. So that's maybe additional listing for people. It's online, but anyhow, so yes, retrofits are absolutely necessary. And so we started Highland Park saying, well, we've got to figure this out. If we can't tear everything down and we can't retrofit, but we have to retrofit, what the hell are we going to do? And we started looking at, one, we did a bit of a competitive analysis and started looking at, all right, who else is out there working on this problem? And what we found is that there's a massive amount of energy and money going into technologies around solar panels, heat pumps, new HVAC systems, geothermal systems, meta materials, lots of interesting stuff, but that by and large, people were staying away from the shell of the building.
Yeah.
And when we look
Envelope.
at the envelope, right? When we look at the where if you make a pie chart of where the carbon is, the envelope is almost half, if not more in many cases, of where the energy is lost. So, a lot of people through the 90s and 2000s thought, okay, if I replace my windows, I'm doing a deep energy retrofit. Well, windows are only 6 to 8% of a typical house, carbon footprint. So you're spending a ton of money on windows, but you're not actually getting a great gain. Problem is redoing the envelope is very expensive. It involves a lot of labor. It's messy. It's disruptive. It can take multiple weeks. And so we started looking at, all right, how can we make either new machinery or new systems to automate the process of retrofitting the envelope? So for us, what retrofitting means is we're going to remove the existing cladding and we're going to replace it with a system that not only air seals the building, but also improves the R value, the insulated value of the wall assembly. And we need to do it in a way where there is as minimal amount of labor as possible. And far too often when we look at prefab companies or modular companies, what they're doing to make something automated is they're actually just moving labor around. So they're taking labor and instead of it being a carpenter in the field, it's now somebody sitting behind a computer programming a robot. Or instead of, putting the time into moving material up and down a ladder, you've got a trucking company that has to drive everything in. And net, when we look at most of these companies, we actually see that they're not actually reducing labor, they're just moving it around. And yes, some of it is lower impact and some of it is better to the workers. But unless we really hit that labor reduction, we're never going to be able to systematize retrofits. So we have 3 different systems we're working on, slab, grid, and in situ. We're coming up with better names. I'm sure we'll have them at some point, but for that's how we refer to them. And they all involve a process where our holy grail is basically that somebody can take an iPhone, walk around the outside of their house with the iPhone, upload the LiDAR file to an online platform, and then with a series of sliders, basically design their entire kit of parts without needing an architect, without needing an engineer, without needing a lengthy permitting process. We're trying to automate the entire damn thing because we don't want to just move that labor around. So.
It seems like you're trying to empower the individual to make their home, their building, their environment more sustainable, more energy efficient.
I wish the empowerment was actually the reason we are, but that's not actually the reason we're doing it, because we can't have all of these people involved in the process. You have to pay people. Mm-hmm. And we just can't, when we look at, where the costs are, we have to eliminate every human hour we possibly can. One thing we can't get around is how much does a square foot of insulation cost? Or how much does a gallon of one of the resins we're using cost? Like, we can't get around that. Those are economies of scale that are so far beyond our control that we can't do that. So we have to fix everything else, basically. So.
Yeah, bringing back to the discussion on career, and we believe most of the listeners out there would be interested or coming from the architecture background. And you, as a licensed GC and developer and also an entrepreneur, you're partnering with an architect on your current venture. You partnered with other architects in your past ventures, and you work with and you hire architects to do your buildings. So I think you're very well positioned to see the work of an architect from a perspective of a non-architect. Why do you partner with architects so many times? What do you see as their strength? And on the same time, what do you see as their weaknesses, and how can we improve it?
So I have an art background as well. I, to this day, do ceramics, welding, woodworking. I love art. I love what art makes people think and how it makes people think. I like how it challenges norms, and I see some of that overlap in good architects. I see that access to creativity and that access to a side of the brain that frankly most people lack. And so architects' creativity, I think, can be their greatest skill. Minku will be the first to tell you, I've got a bit of a salty relationship with architects because I think there's a world, there's many different flavors of architects, right? Just like there's many flavors of artists. You have some architects who are really into it for their name and their ego, and they're, wanting to be the person. They want to be the next Corbu, or they want to be the next IMP, or, that. Then there's people that are in it for the impact they can have on the world, like positively. And I would argue that architects can actually have the greatest impact on the world of just about any profession out there, far more than most architects, I think, give themselves credit for or take risks with. And then, there's the other, maybe the third flavor of architect where they do it as a job and it's just a 9 to 5 thing, and they're really just trying to push buildings out the other end and, stamp drawings, and it's just a career. And I think the challenge in working with architects is finding the happy medium between all three of those, because really, all three of those are valid. Making a name for yourself is valid. Getting a good reputation is valid. Saving the world is valid. And having something that pays the bills and, actually provides a career and a living is also valid. And I think, where I come down on different architects is that balance between those three. It's really, as a builder, I have to find an architect who, at the end of the day, will put their pencil down and say, okay, this is good enough. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. You can go off and build it. You can have a successful project. I'm not building museums. If I was building museums or fancy skyscrapers, I would probably be in a different world where I would say, I want the fanciest, best architect out there that can make a total work of art. But I'm not there. I'm unfortunately down in the trenches, like having to work with real budgets. So, yeah.
I think that's such an incredible answer, actually, because I was just going to say, I mean, what you described in terms of the genres of architects, I think a lot of us intuit naturally, but it's interesting to hear from someone adjacent, but sort of outside the field a little bit, to see, we do need a balance. And I guess one of my questions would be, like, is there a certain mindset that you can identify that represents that balance, or is there a certain kind of outlook that you think, or I think even for younger architects, what is something that would kind of get you there?
I think so. Architecture, sorry, not to get on a soapbox, but I've been learning about AI for the past year. It's unreal, and I'm in it like every day because we're actually applying AI to a lot of what we're doing. If you had told me 12 months ago that I was going to be working on a segmentation separation deep learning model, I would have said, what am I working on now? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's interesting to have this conversation right now, because the industry is about to change really rapidly, far more rapid than most people are willing to accept, especially older architects. And it's probably a great time to be in architecture school because you're being exposed to all this, but man, do I fear for the older architects out in the industry. But in terms of younger architects, I think that there's going to be increasingly less opportunity to be able to punch the clock, because the clock punching jobs are going to go away. The jobs where, you can just sit behind a desk and be the drafts person that takes somebody else's grand idea and turns it into a drawing set, that's going to go away, because AI is already in many ways better than humans at taking a concept and turning it into an actual structural engineered drawing set. So I think going back to the whole premise of the three types of architects, it's going to be more critical than ever to find that right balance between, financial realism for the end project, mission, and ego. Like, it's going to have to be some really fine line between those three worlds, because you're not going to get anywhere as as it gets harder and harder to get jobs in architecture, which it will, ego will be more important because now you're going to have to really prove yourself out in the world. Mission is going to matter because nobody's going to work with you if you're not involved in, societal change, economic justice, environmental, concerns, and people are going to have AI-driven options around financial models. Minku may squirm to hear this, but I have a project that I was working on with the firm that Minku was working with, where I needed to redo the facades on it, and SketchUp just came out with this new AI program where I can input a very basic facade, and I can move sliders around for materials, and I can get renderings that, frankly, architects are going to cringe at, but the members of the community that I'm presenting it to are going to say, oh, there's a brick building, there's a wood building, there's there's that. And so it's already changing. I mean, at least for me in my practice, it's already changing rapidly. So it's a fascinating time, and career is going to be such a critical question. I'm so glad you guys are talking to people about that. So
I feel like there's kind of maybe like an underlying theme of like learning and adaptation, both from your experience at Placetailor, but also kind of what you're building at Highland Park. And I think while you were talking about Placetailor, you touched upon this notion of culture and how kind of culture made or broke your experience at Placetailor. So what kind of culture are you trying to create at Placetailor, and does learning and adaptation kind of feed into what you're trying to build?
So at Highland Park Technologies, it's an interesting model because we just received a very large Department of Energy grant to basically go out and apply our systems to 3 full-scale buildings. So the next 24 months are going to be make or break for us. They're going to be fascinating, and I'm excited either way. It's either going to work great or it's going to fail catastrophically. And either one is okay by me because I'm going to learn something. But in terms of culture, so Placetailor, every time we needed to solve something, we hired somebody else. We brought somebody else in the company because we kind of had this idea that, well, we're going to be an all-encompassing company that will be able to do anything. If you want architecture, we can do that. If you want building, we can do that. And so it was an extremely expensive growth model. We were up to close to 30 employees. Our payroll was getting to a point where we were hundreds of $1,000s a month. It's a large beast to feed. And I think many architecture firms, actually operate that way. I know a number of them where one project not turning around on time can make or break the company. And so that said, our culture for Highland Park is a little bit more cognizant of the fact that we're in some areas in more of a gig economy and a consulting economy and a part-time economy where we have to do a rendering for a historical district for one of our projects. And in the past, I would have hired an architect that could have done rendering on staff. But now there's a number of services I can hire online to outsource it to somebody who does it part-time. And so we're doing that. So we're much leaner, but weirdly we're getting more done because we are probably more properly focused on the things where we can add something to it and not on the things where it's work that someone else could do better than we could. And so the culture we have, right now we're only 4 people, but we have a pretty intense conversation internally about, all right, who's our next hire going to be? Do we actually need to hire that person? Or can we outsource it? And we're also trying to make sure that we're constantly challenging our own assumptions. So, there really can't be any sacred cows with what we're doing, even down to the level of like when we first started this, we started saying like, okay, we're going to create a sacred cow. We're going to make sure that everything we do is made out of bio-based materials. 2 years ago, we said, okay, bio-based. And we did that because bio-based really has a better carbon footprint. But bio-based brings a lot of challenges with, working with the materials, decomposition, weathering, stuff like that. And just a couple months ago, we kind of sat down and said, well, hold on a second. Like, we've created a sacred cow in bio-based. What happens if we were to start utilizing inorganic materials now, with the assumption that there's probably somebody over at MIT, of all places, just down the road, figuring out how to make that product bio-based? And where that was coming out of was that in Massachusetts, we now have, a company in Boston Metal that is making a almost carbon-free steel. We have a couple dozen companies that are coming up with really amazing ways to make concrete carbon-free. We know that there are companies out there trying to make plastics using algae and different biological processes. And so wouldn't it be smarter of us to develop systems that can use certain qualities of materials, not specific types of materials? And so we've kind of shifted our focus a little bit to think of it more systematically, so that if at some point somebody comes up with a polyiso insulation that's made with algae, we already have this great product line that can utilize a polyiso-like product. Or, if it's always going to be wood fiber, we have a product that can use wood fiber. And we're thinking it more as systems that can be plugged into, as opposed to really specific products that are super dependent on one thing, because it just seems like the speed of innovation is accelerating, and it probably will continue to do so at a clip that, in my 24 years in business, seems a lot faster now than it did 20 years ago. And maybe that's just me getting older and my brain rusty, but I just think we have to be more flexible in how we generate things so that we can shift with the market.
But there's something interesting too. Yeah, we've had similar conversations, the three of us, about how we feel like, design, the built environment is changing in a way. You have less large corporations, you have smaller outfits doing specific things. And the whole idea actually behind the podcast is to bring those people together so they know what's out there, and then they can start to incorporate them in their own work. But the flexibility word that you use is not one that's generally associated with the construction industry. And since you come from, you're a GC, come from that background, how do you start to bring some of that innovation into an industry which is traditionally just very stagnant, very averse to any sort of change?
So architects are often like Americans going to a foreign country, and instead of speaking the language that somebody is speaking, they're trying to speak English louder at them to get into what they're doing. Having been to a lot of countries in South America, it's amazing when you see Americans that don't speak Spanish, like, open the door. And it's like, no, they still can't understand it if you say it louder. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the architect builder interactions, both directions, end up being that, where because they're not speaking the same language on many different levels, which we can talk about a little bit, they end up speaking louder at each other, and you end up in, lawsuits and litigation and slowdowns and delays. Obviously there's IPD and there's, all these other processes out there that can benefit, but even in those situations, you have to get everybody speaking the same language. And I think on a smaller scale architecture and builder level, yeah, you know what? A lot of contractors didn't go to college. A lot of contractors may lean towards the right side of the political spectrum and not the left. A lot of builders, may feel very differently about immigration than, somebody on the progressive side of the spectrum. But there is a way to communicate where you're not arguing with one another. You're actually speaking, the same language. And so, for instance, with Passive House, selling builders on Passive House has always been hard, because a lot of builders don't believe in climate change. They just don't. They lean right, and climate change, it's that half of the country that doesn't believe in climate change. And so, where we started changing our language, we stopped, a lot of our marketing, we stopped talking about climate change. We said, all right, we're going to build a home that gets you off of Saudi oil. We're going to build a home that gets you, if the grid goes down, you're free of the grid. We're going to build you a home that's more comfortable. It's more comfortable for your family and your children. And we started trying to plug our language into the same language that somebody from a different political spectrum would understand. And I think that can be applicable to any diverse group that you run into, whether it's diversity on race, gender, sexual orientation, financial, anything. You can speak a different language. And being aware of that, I think, is so, so critical. Not talking down to your builders is so critical because, you know what, frankly, most builders know a lot of things that architects don't.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
And don't have to deal with. So, yeah, I could talk for hours about that. Sorry.
No, it's like you can dismiss what people have to say, or you can be curious about what people have to say. And I think it takes a certain level of empathy to be curious about it.
Right. So that is part of where Highland Park, I think, we're hitting a happy stride right now, is that amongst the four of us, we have an architect, we have somebody who's a fabrication expert, we have me, who's a serial entrepreneur and a builder. We have another drafts person that's somewhere in between all three of us. And we're trying to speak all three languages at the same time. So, while the architect may design something that stylistically looks beautiful, I'm not going to allow it out the door if my builder can't figure it out easily. And our fabricator is not going to allow it to pass if he can't fabricate it easily. And so we know that even though it means that some of our ideas get shot down, that ultimately this is going towards, a really well-working system. And I spoke at a conference a few days ago and was speaking with a couple other companies that are working on similar challenges. And it was interesting because those companies were very siloed in terms of what they were. One was, a robotics company. The other was a research institute. And it was just interesting how each one kind of forgot about the architecture and forgot about the builder. And they had some great ideas. And there's obviously some stuff that if we could, we'd incorporate into our own systems. But it's amazing how quickly you can pull something apart when you don't talk to all the stakeholders. Basically, the people in the room that this got presented to were saying things like, what happens when, I get up there to nail that on the side of a house and it doesn't fit right because the house is crooked or, this, and the person had no answer for it because guess what? That person who designed it had never gotten on the side of a house to try to nail something on the side of a house before. Or, vice versa, the, material was like the roboticist says, well, I can't get a machine to pick that up or move that around. And so I think going back to the career and what do architects need to know in the future, I think it's a lot more languages than we had to know in the past. I think you're going to have to speak Builder. I think you're going to have to speak AI. I think you're going to have to speak engineering. I think you're going to have to speak cost. And even if you don't have an expert knowledge of those things, being able to understand where the other side comes from and what is happening on the other side, I think is going to be more important than ever because, again, AI is going to replace the silo jobs. The silo jobs are going to get replaced, and then what's going to be left are the people that can cross different lines.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I mean, one thing that I learned and I really enjoyed at Placetailor was the opportunity to talk to different people who are on the same job, who comes from a different background. So you understand what their limitations are, what they're struggling with, and what I can do to help them, and vice versa. Was that? But also, going back to your personal story, Evan. You said you did an undergrad in architecture. but then after graduation, you chose to go into the more on the builder side, on the GC side of things. What made you make that change or make that decision?
Uh, so I love MIT. I love architecture professors, but there was a critique I had at MIT that made me never want to be an architect. And it was the end of the year, end of the semester project. And we had been challenged with, it's like burned in my mind, this whole process. We have been challenged to design a development for an artist in the South End. So we were given this plot of land that existed in the South End of Boston and said, hey, talk to this artist. It was a real person. Learn what they want and design them a beautiful project. And I and a couple other classmates did the thing. We're like, well, it's an artist. Like, this should be a work of art. This should really draw attention. This should stand out. This should be different than all of those brick row houses that are there. Now, obviously, we all tried to design contextually, but some of us got really skewered for being too creative and too outside the bounds. And I realized at that point, and then also, early on in Placetailor, that an architect has limited control often over what they can actually do. There's obviously budget constraints, there's client constraints, there's, community constraints. And I kind of hit this point where I was like, well, one, if I'm going to have any control, I need to have more financial control over the process. And the builder and the developer always has more control over the financial process. And I also thought if I'm going to do anything wacky or anything strange, that I need to be able to have that control. And I wanted to do stuff that was wacky and strange. Placetailor designed some odd little ducks of buildings. Like they're different. You can tell a Placetailor building when you see it. And not necessarily because, we wanted, I don't think at first it was about ego. It's just because we were trying different things. We wanted to do something that hadn't been done before. So I think that I got out of architecture because, one, it's a tough career. It's challenging to make a living for a lot of people. I've watched too many architects I knew work 80 hours a week and still not really make a living. Sorry to be negative about that, but that seems to be a reality for a lot of people. And I think that, that's what steered me. Now, that said, I think that one of the exciting things that's happening right now is that a lot of that work that drove those 80-hour work weeks could potentially go away because of advancements in the software and the AI. And so I think there's this like golden moment for architects to actually be more creative than they've ever been and focus more on the creative side than the drafting side of things. And that gives me a lot of hope for architects. It's I don't know.
So we're nearing the final line here. I just want to wrap us up with maybe one or two more questions. Feel free to join, but I will go with one. So with your decision of switching to the builders, you probably had more control, as you mentioned, on the finance end, but that means also you will probably have more responsibility in what you decide to build. Those type of responsibility from the architecture standpoint, and I think the reason why the architects can be so creative and free is the detachment that they create in their mindset with the reality, so that they can maximize their freedom. And I think a lot of education in schools, in the architecture school, is skewed towards enhancing that creativity, like trying to make them think about and make them think about the vision of the project rather than the nitty-gritties and what actually makes a building a building. I guess the question that I have is, if you go back to the moment when you made that decision, and with all your knowledge that you have and your experience that you have, when you go back to that point when you made that decision to switch, would you make the same decision then? And if not, or what would you tell yourself at that moment? Tell to yourself at that moment as an advice, knowing all the things that you have experienced.
I don't know that I could go back to that moment and tell myself anything, because 25 years ago, the industry was different. I mean, I was talking to Christian this morning. Like, I learned how to draft on Vectorworks. I don't know if you guys remember that. That was a clunky piece of software. I don't even know if it's around anymore. But, and you know, yeah, that's a tough question. I think what I will say is that how do I put this? There is an opportunity for architects to be able to simultaneously design and have full unbridled creativity at the same time that they're paying attention to the numbers. And the reason I say that is because I watched this little demo of somebody playing with an AI app, and they had the AI app design a house using vinyl siding, which is like the most unsexy, cheapest material you could possibly use. And you know what? The AI didn't have any trouble coming up with some really creative ideas, because the AI was not biased against vinyl siding as a material because it's cheap. And I far too often I've seen architects I've worked with get really wrapped up in this like really sexy, beautiful material that they found, you know, this like amazing brick or this amazing terracotta, or, you know, there's this tactile feel to material that can really hook somebody into wanting to use that material in a building. And unfortunately, you know, when it's just like the sacred cows in Highland Park, when you start to say, well, I'm only going to use this material because it's beautiful, or I'm only going to use this because it's beautiful, you start to close yourself down to other possibilities of what you can make. I got really turned on recently by this company in Sri Lanka that's making bamboo structures. They're doing crazy things with bamboo, stuff that like I don't think 5 years ago. And partly they're able to do it now because they're actually able to model bamboo in computer software and structurally engineer it using bamboo. But it's such a cheap material, like it's so readily available. And I think that right now, you know, if used properly, some of these new tools that can rapidly price out a project or rapidly iterate or, you know, go out and find other materials, it's creating a new opportunity for architects to harness and unbridle themselves of biases and things that may have held them back previously. It's funny, the number of architects that are really poo-pooing 3D printing. 3D printing for buildings right now, like, I'll give it to you, it's not there yet. I wouldn't use it for my own house. I don't think it's there, but it will be. And whoever gets into it now and starts realizing, oh shit, I can make a round house, I can make a lima bean shaped house, I can do whatever I want with it. Like, the people that start playing with it now and start not being biased against it are going to be the ones who are going to be able to utilize it better in the near future. And so it's like embracing the technology for what it is and trying to, don't have any sacred cows.
Okay. No, I just want to say it's so refreshing talking to you, Evan. And there's a huge line between what you started out talking with, assembling Legos, to everything from starting up Placetailor to going with Highland Park. I'm just fascinated by the way that you approach every opportunity, whether it's an actual design opportunity or just a moment in your life or career to really test things and try things out. And I think your last point too really makes a lot of sense. If you have inhibitions or biases or dogmas, you're going to be restricted in terms of sort of what you can and cannot try.
Life is a giant Lego kit. Play with it. Have fun.
Yeah, and I think we're probably going to have to bring you back for later seasons when we can focus on some of the more specific things that you went into, because there's a lot of fascinating topics I don't think we had enough time to dig into.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sure
Cool.
there will be other opportunities. So I think that's a wrap. Thank you, Evan, for
Great.
your time and
Thank you for
sharing
having
your
me.
journey. If you haven't already, please follow, subscribe, rate the Most Part Podcast on Spotify. We're on Apple. We're soon to be on YouTube as well.
As everybody likes to say, smash that subscribe building, subscribe button.